Hello everyone. Today I wanted to film a quick video showing you a couple of different basic weaving patterns that I use frequently in my work. I've been getting a couple questions about how I do these, and I thought it would be nice for everyone to get a step-by-step guide on how to do these. So the first step to creating any type of weave is your wire. You're gonna want to use a thicker one and a thinner one, which you probably know. I tend to use 18 gauge or 1 millimeter round copper wire, and I use let's see, 26 gauge copper round wire. This one is actually coated, which is why it's as orange as it is, and I thought it'd make a nice contrast to show you guys how to do this weave and these weaves. So the first thing you're going to want to do is take some wire off your spool. Now, I've had a lot of questions about how do you get your wire so straight? How do you make sure there's no kinks in it? And that starts the moment you start taking your wire off the spool. Now, I just have an old tea towel here, and I use that. I grip it with both my thumb and my index finger, and I just run my wire through the tea towel, bending it one way, another way, every which way you can think of, and slowly you'll see that the kinks start coming out. You need to put a little bit of pressure on the wire, and once you've done that, you've created a nice straight piece of wire. Get my wire cutters. Now, most of the wire I'm going to use today is actually scrap, so they won't be as nice and straight as this one. But that won't matter. It'll just maybe look a little bit less neat than if you were to straighten all your wires. So the first thing we're going to do is 2-wire weaving patterns. I've decided to do 2 wires, 3 wires, and 4 wires because anything more complicated than that is a more advanced video for another day. So starting with the 2 wire weaves, we've got 3 patterns that I'm going to go over today. The first one is a really basic one where you just take your weaving wire and you wrap it around both wires, both base wires, until you've got the length that you'd like. I use that in a lot of my pieces. Let me see if I can find something to show you guys. Yes, for example, this one. Let me see if it won't focus. Well, you can see right around here, I've got, well, it doesn't really want to focus, but I've got 2 wires, which have just been wrapped all the way with the weaving wire. And you can use it in lots of pieces. People use it for bales, people use it for very simple designs. For example, another one is this rose quartz piece that I've done. I use it at the bottom to connect the wires. This is actually with 3 wires, so you can see that this technique is also usable with different amounts of wires. And the top one also has been done in that same way. Now keep in mind, none of my pieces are currently polished, so they're a bit orange and a bit dirty, but in terms of demonstrating, that should be fine. So we'll start on the 2 wire weaves. So you're going to want to take 2 base wires, and you're going to want to take, in my case, I've just cut a piece of 26 gauge, but you could leave it on the spool if you'd like. And then how I always start my weaves all the time, because you want to make sure that your weave is secured on the wires, is I start out by just wrapping simply 3 loops. I'm going to try not to put my hands in the way, but you just wrap 3 little loops. See if it wants to focus. Not really. Hello. Doesn't really want to focus today. But there's 3 little loops on the wire. So the next thing you're going to want to do for the simplest weave that I've shown you is you take your second piece, you lay it next to your first one, and you just take your wire and you just bend it over. And you keep doing that all the way around, all the way around. You can do this fairly quickly after a while, until you've got the length that you'd like to have. I have no idea if this is in focus. I don't think so. Okay, so I've zoomed in a little bit to make it easier to see what I'm actually doing. So I've done a couple of wraps around both wires. Now you can see there's a little bit of a gap here, and you might see as well, though I'm not sure. No, it seems rather flat. It's not. At the moment, it's not very flat. So what you're going to want to do after every couple of wraps to make this nice and neat, I'll just turn this around to make it easier for myself. So you're going to get your flat nose pliers, and you're going to want to just take your nail, put it against it, and then push against the weave. And you're also going to want to take the flat end of your pliers and just squeeze, and then once again compressing the weave with your pliers. And then you can just continue depending on how long you need this weave to be. You just wrap. Now, one thing you need to make sure of, I'm going to continue on these wires to make the rest of the examples, so I'm not going to worry about that right now. But if you were to want to end this weave, you'd of course have to make sure that both of your end pieces end up at the same side. So as you can see, it's a rather simple, clean looking weave. Now I'm going to cut my weaving wire off because I'm going to need some space in between the wires. Because that's one thing, if you do this type of weave, you're going to not have a lot of space in between your two base wires anymore. So if you want to transition, for example, to a different weave, you're going to find that a little bit difficult because there is no space in between these wires. It's a little bit fiddly. You could do it, but I tend to not do that because it doesn't look as neat. Let me just wrap this around. All right, so the second example we're going to look at, let me just grab my notebook here, is this one. Another very basic weave that I use all the time in all of my pieces. I make pieces out of just that weave as well. For example, if you look at this little snake pendant or earrings, whatever, it's all the same weave. And you can also use it as an accent weave. Again, this piece, you can see right here that it's that weave. So how do we do this? How do we start this weave and how do we work on it? Just get this out of the way. So again, just pull this apart a little bit. You're going to want to start with the 3 loops that you always use. So it's sliding around a little bit on me. You're going to want to start with those 3 loops that you always do to secure the weaving wire. There, I have 3 little loops. And then depending on the distance you want between your double wraps, you can make that anything you'd like. You could do 3 like I've done here. You can do more or less, but that might get a bit too tight. And with this you want to make sure that you wrap it nice and loose 2 times around both wires. Because the thing is, if you wrap it as tight as we've done with this previous one, you're going to not be able to continue this weave around the first base wire. So you want to wrap it nice and loose, don't pull it too tightly. And then you just continue with the single loops. So I've decided today I'm going to do 3 loops. So I do 3 loops around this base wire, and then once again 2 loops around the 2. And you always finish it off, or at least I do, I always finish it off with another 3 loops around the base wire. Now with this one again, you want to take your, let me see, flat nose pliers, and you want to compress the weave. Just push on it and flatten it with your pliers. Now if you're going for a more bulky look, you don't have to flatten it with your pliers. I've done that in some of my pieces because it looks interesting. But most of the times I do compress the weave. And again, you can continue this as long as you'd like. Making sure again that if you're going to cut off your weaving wire, that you're going to leave the ends on the same side. So that's the second. Yeah, I'm not finishing these off neatly, of course. I just want to demonstrate today how to do these weaves. So then another weave that you can do, which is 2 wires. It's one that I don't use as frequently because I don't really prefer it, but I've seen it a lot, so I wanted to include it, is this one, where you do 2 wraps around the bottom wire, 2 wraps around the top, and you just repeat that until you've got the length that you want. Now in this case, you could get away with just starting your wrap out with just 2 loops around your base wire. That's okay. That would be secure. I always just take 3 because I'm used to that. So again, starting with 3 loops. And now we go all the way underneath both base wires. We go over the top one, but we're going to bring it down in between the 2 wires. And I always use my nail just to guide the wire to its place. And then you do another loop around the top wire, again using my nail to guide the wire. And now you bring it down and over the bottom base wire. You again, let me open this up a little bit, bring it down in between the 2 using your nail or your finger or your pliers, whatever you find more useful, to guide the wire. Then you go up again, over and under in between, and you just repeat this motion until you get to a point where you're happy. Now with this one again, it's important not to pull too tightly because you might kink the base wires and you don't want that. So that would look a little bit like this before you compress anything. Again, taking my pliers, putting my nail at one end and just gently pushing. Now with this one, you can also take your pliers and just take the 2 loops and push them together a little bit. And there you have it. Now you keep on continuing this pattern, and every few repeats you're going to want to compress the weave again to make it as neat as possible. Again, cutting it off both ends the same side. And that's your basic 3 types of 2 wire weaves. Now the easy thing about these is these slide around your wire pretty easily. So let's say you've got a tight space where you want to fit them, but you can't reach your wires all the way there. If you keep it loose enough, you can just wrap it at the ends and gently slide it down. I've done that in a couple of my pieces, which are very tight, and it works every time if you wrap it loose enough. Of course, you don't want to wrap it too loose because then it's not gonna ever look neat. So you're just gonna find that balance for yourself. Now, the next part is the 3 wire weaves, which we're gonna get a little bit more complicated with those. But they also look a lot more interesting, in my opinion. So again, I've got 3 for you guys. These are, well, 2 of these I use frequently and 1 I don't, which is again a variation on the one I just did. But I've seen it a lot and I wanted to include it. So the first one we're gonna do is, I kind of find that it looks like a pyramid. And I really enjoyed it. I use it in a lot of my pieces. Let's see if I can find one. Again, not polished at all, so it's a little bit dirty, but for this one you can clearly see that I've used that weave to create sort of a pyramid-like structure. You can do this with 3 wires. You can also do it with more. The pattern remains the same. You just add more base wires. So that's the first one we're gonna try. So again, you take 3 base wires. I've just got another 3 pieces of 18 gauge. You're gonna take your weaving wire, which is still for me 26. You could also use, let's see, 20 gauge and 28. People like to use that. That's fine. That works just as well. Well, I also, like I said, I always start off wrapping 3 loops around this first base wire, and then we're going to add in our second one, which we just lay on top of the weaving wire, and then we wrap I decided to do 3 times. You could also do it 2 times. That's fine. Completely up to you. There we go. That's 3 wraps around 2 base wires. And then we add in the third one, which we also wrap 3 times in total. Well, it's very important that you keep the wires laying nicely next to one another. And there we go. That's true. Let me use my nail to push that in a little bit. That's 3 times around 3 wires. Now, you're going to want to come in, just open this up a little bit, in between the top wire and the second wire. These are a bit, so this is like this. And then you're going to want to wrap 3 times around the bottom 2 wires. So that's 3 times. And then you're going to come up in between the bottom and the second wire. And as you can see, I'm actually having a little bit of trouble. I need to pull quite harshly on my wires, which means I've got a little bit too much tension in those last 3 wraps. That's okay. You can use your pliers to move that around a little bit. You should be okay. But you need to remember that you really need to lay the wires down. You don't want to pull too harshly, or else you're not going to be able to fit your wire in between each of these. Now, as you can see, this is not the neatest thing in the world. So what you're going to want to do is, again, take your flat nose pliers, put your nail at one end, and gently push. And in this case, you can even hold your pliers a little bit on an angle to hit all 3 pieces at once. And what I do like to do with these type of weaves is that I compress them, or I flatten them, because that just makes them a lot neater. And then once again, I compress them using my nail and the pliers. And you can see that is a whole lot neater. And then again, you can repeat this as many times as you'd like. You can even alter the space in between. I have done 3 loops here. You could do 5, or you could do more. You could do less if you'd want. That would just get the pyramids sort of to be tighter together. And again, you want to make sure when you cut off your weaving wire that you do that at the same time as you have your starting end. So in this case, for me, it's the back. Again, I'm not going to finish these off neatly because they're just examples, but whatever works for you. And then the next one, I'm going to slide this down. With these, you can't slide them as easily. You can when you've not flattened them yet. So if you want to slide these around a little bit, don't flatten them yet. But once you flatten them, it's pretty difficult to move them around. So keep that in mind when working on these pieces. Let me get another piece of weaving wire. And let me show you the second one that we're going to do, which is this one, which looks a lot like the first one we did, except for now going around all 3 wires, you're only going to go around 2 at a time, which just gives a little bit of a different look. Let's see if I can find a piece that I've used that technique on. I think it's this one. So if you look at this one here at the side, you can see I've done that weaving pattern. So it's a couple of single loops, then 2 at the bottom, 2 at the 2 top wires, 2 at the bottom, and a couple of single loops. So that's what we're going to do with this one. And again, let me just curl that a little bit. Well, that helps sometimes. Curling the ends, I tend to do that gently. Of course, this curve is not gentle at all. This is just a practice piece. So again, starting with the 3 loops, like I always do. Now, the next step you're going to want to do is just wrap the wire around the bottom 2 wires twice. Now, you can pull them a little bit to get them a little bit closer together, but you want to make sure that there's still space in between them. Then you go all the way to the top with your wire, come down over the top 2 and go in between that bottom and that second wire. Then you want to wrap around that again, where you have 2 loops, and then you are still at the bottom of your piece. You want to kind of come up in between the top and the second wire. and then wrap around the bottom two times. Then you're once again at the back of your piece, and you're going to want to come up in between the bottom wire and the second wire and wrap your single loops. Again, you can do as many or as little as you'd like. And that makes one repeat of this weave. Now again, you can use your pliers just to gently compress this weave. Oh. And you'll see if you compress this weave that the gap that you had between these two portions, normally there's a gap. And if you compress it, that gap's going to close. Now that might be something you enjoy, that might be something you don't enjoy, but you can take that into account. You can gently just use your pliers to compress it without losing that gap in between. That's just a matter of personal preference. Again, when you cut off your wire, make sure it's at the same side as the tail that you started with. And then we have one last version of one last variant of a 3-wire weave, and that's this one. And that's just a variation on the 2-wire weave that we did the last, but now with 3 wires. So you're going to do 2 loops around the bottom one, bottom 2 loops around the top 2, and just continue. Again, I don't use this one very frequently, but I've seen lots of people really enjoy this, so I'm including it. Once again, 3 loops at the bottom, and then you do 2 loops around the bottom 2. You go all the way to the top with your wire, you go over, and you go down in between the bottom and the second wire. And then you're once again at the bottom. You're going to come up between the top and the second wire. Kind of like the one we did just now. Except now you're going to continue right away without any single loops in between. Where you do another 2 at the top. And you repeat that process. 2 at the bottom. 2 at the top. I'm just going to make a little bit of length here to show you what it looks like. There we go. So that's how that one looks. Again, you can use your pliers just to gently compress that. There we go. I also tend to compress the middle wire in this case. And there we have a pretty neat looking piece of weaving. Again, you can also flatten this if you'd like. Doesn't add too much to this specific weave because it's already pretty flat of itself. And of course, you can also do let me just quickly include that as well. This one, where you just go around all 3 wires. You can do that with this as well, which is very simple. You just wrap, wrap, wrap. Making sure you do put them next to one another, not over one another. And you just continue wrapping until you're satisfied with the length. And in this case of this specific weave, whether you do it with 2 wires or more or less, you're going to definitely want to, first of all, compress it every so often, and second of all, flatten it. Because that just makes it a whole lot neater. So that makes that. Again, cutting it off at the same side as the other tail. So that's the 3-wire weaving patterns. And then we've got another one which is 4-wire weaving patterns, which we've got another variation on the second weave we did with the 3 wires, which just looks a little bit different, but still very interesting. We've got a very intricate design that I used on another pendant a bit back, which can actually be used on both sides. And then we've got one which has a pretty long repeating pattern, as you can see, and I've used that in some of my pieces as well, which is very interesting, but doesn't use as much wire as, for example, the second one. So first of all, we're going to take 4 pieces of 18 gauge wire. These are all just scrap pieces. So this one is very short. I'm not sure if I'm gonna, no, let me just get a new piece for that, because I'm gonna run out of wire and that will be a little bit annoying. So let me just straighten a piece off camera. There we go. Cutting it off and adding it to the 4 wires that I already have, 3 wires that I already had. And then we start again like all the other weaving patterns with 3 loops at the bottom. It's starting to get boring. And then for the first pattern, we're going to add in our 2nd wire now. You lay them on top of one another and you loosely wrap around the both of them twice. Now you take your, this one is very wonky, but doesn't matter. You take your 3rd wire and you loosely wrap around the top 2 twice. So you need to go down in between the 1st and the 2nd wire. As you can see, this one wants to get a bit wonky on me. So you're going to use your nails or your pliers or fingers just to create a neat wrap. That's 3 wires, and then you're going to add in your 4th wire, again laying them on top. Just try my best to make that a bit clearer. And then you wrap around the top 2, making sure that your wraps are loose, because otherwise you're not going to fit a wire in between them anymore, and you do need to do that. So you've got the first side of the wrap done. Now you're going to come up in between the top 2 wires and wrap twice around the middle 2 wires. Let's see. Oh. All right, using your nail again to just push that in. And then you're going to want to come up through the middle and wrap around the bottom 2. And then you're going to want to come up in between the bottom 2 and do a couple of single loops. In my case, I always do 3. And there you have it. So that's the same weave that we did with the 3 wires, but this time using 4. And as you can see, it looks a little bit different. Let me see if I can't get the 3 wire weave. As you can see, it's the middle one in this case. They look a little bit different, right? This one is a bit, the 4 wire weave is a little bit more interesting to look at. And again, as we did with all the other weaves, you can just use your pliers to compress it a little bit. You can also flatten it a little bit. That does make it less movable. So that will be this weave. Cutting off the tail again at the same place as your starting tail. And again, this one doesn't want to move very well once you've flattened and compressed it. So you got to think about that when you start your weave. I'm going to take my last weaving wire. And now we're going to get into this more complicated pattern. So this one takes a lot of wire, a lot of patience. And I've actually used the back of this weave, which I'm going to show you as well, on this pendant that I've posted on some of the Facebook groups that I'm in. And this is actually how the back looks. So that's also rather interesting to look at. But as you can see, it does use quite a lot of wire. So once again, starting out with 3 loops at the bottom, like usual. Let me just remove that to make things a bit more clear. 3 wraps. Alright, so normally this weave starts with 1 loop at the bottom. Well, we've got 3, but that doesn't matter for the pattern because this is just your starting point. Then you're going to want to do 1 wrap around the bottom 2, 1 wrap around the middle 2, and 1 wrap around the top 2. You're going to use your nails to compress that a little bit. And then you're going to do 1 loop across the top wire. So that's why you still need to wrap these a little bit loosely, or else you can't fit that last loop there. Now you're going to bring that back to the bottom, over it. over all 4 wires. You're going to start again with a single loop at the bottom, 2 loops, or 1 loop around the bottom 2, 1 loop around the middle 2, and 1 loop around the top 2, finishing it off with 1 loop around the top wire before once again bringing it all the way down over all 4. Now this does not look neat or pleasant or anything like that. So for this one, it's very important that you take your pliers and you compress the shit out of that thing. Oops. And then once you've compressed it, it already looks a lot better. Then you also want to flatten this in this case. And then maybe compress it again if some of the wires decided to go wonky again. And there you've got this pattern. Now I'm going to do a couple of these off screen to show you just what it looks like once you've got a bit of length and a bit of a pattern at the back. Alright, so I've done a couple of these repeats off screen. I've done about 5 of them, and you can see now that it's a pretty intricate, pretty delicate looking weave. I haven't actually flattened this yet. Let me do that real quick. And then you can see it looks even better. Now, as I've mentioned before, I actually used the back of this weave, so let's see what that looks like. Turn it around, we actually get this pattern, which is also very interesting. So you can use this weave in both ways, whether you prefer the front or the back for your piece. Just remember that this one really does take quite a bit of time. It took me like 2 or 3 hours just to do 10 centimeters of this. And that's even relatively fast because I'm a pretty fast weaver, if I do say so myself. Now, the last one that I wanted to show you guys, I'm not sure if I'm gonna have enough wire for that, but I hope so. Again, this one actually does slide relatively easily, even if you compress it and flatten it. So let's hope this is enough wire. So the last one we're gonna do is it's not a complicated pattern, it just takes a bit of time and practice. And I've used this one, for example, in this piece right here, where you can see it's a pretty nice pattern. It leaves a lot of wire without any wraps, which I think is nice personally. But it does have a long sequence before you've actually done a repeat. So I'm going to show you guys how to do this one. And it's actually a pretty standard one, because we're going to do, once again, 3 loops at the bottom, like I always do. And then after the 3 loops at the bottom, you're going to do 2 loops around the bottom 2. Simple as that. I'm going to do 2 loops in between now. I generally do 3, but it's just to make it a little bit faster. And I do 2 loops around the bottom wire, and then 2 loops around the bottom 3 wires. So that goes around there. I'm not going to pull very tightly because I want space in between these wires for later on. Then again, doing 2 loops at the bottom base wire, and then 2 more loops around the bottom 2 base wires. Get that in between there. So that's part 1. We're going to then do another 2 loops around the bottom base wire, and we're going to do 2 loops around the bottom 3 base wires this time. So not the bottom 2, but the bottom 3. Then you're going to do 2 more loops around the bottom 1, and you're going to do 2 wraps around all 4. Now, as you can see, this is the first time that you're actually connecting the 4th base wire. So you're going to have to hold them tightly in your hands for a couple of seconds. Then again, 2 loops around the bottom, 2 loops around the bottom 3. Oh, That's the second part. Well, I mean 2 more loops. First of all, first 2 more loops around the bottom, and that's the second part of the weave done. Then we're going to repeat that first part, so 2 more loops around the, let me just use my nail for a sec there, bottom 2, 2 more loops around the bottom 1, 2 loops around the bottom 3, 2 loops around the bottom base wire, 2 loops around the bottom 2, and 2 loops around the bottom base wire. And that actually concludes 1 repeat of this weave. Now you can easily see this is not all very neat. So this weave again really likes to be compressed, really likes to be flattened. And for this one, you're going to want to use your pliers to change the angles on your little double wraps a little bit if you want. You can make them a little more straight, a little more towards one side or the other. Let's see if I can get my pliers in between there. There we go. And then you're going to want to flatten them once you're happy with that. And compress them again. Making sure you once again put these at the angle that you want them to be. Honestly, this is one of those weaves that you can play around with for hours, perfecting it. But honestly, I think it looks good like this. And if you wanted to continue this weave, you just start again with the 2 loops around the bottom 2, and then repeat until you've got again the length that you'd like. Cutting off the base, cutting off the weaving wire again at the same side as your tail at the front of the weave, or the beginning of the weave. And that's how you do this one. So that's 9 different weaving patterns in one video. I'll once again put this here for you guys to see. Let me zoom out a little bit again. Oop, there we go. It's a bit, let's see, there we go. So these are the patterns that I've used. These are the patterns that I've shown you, and I hope you can now implement these patterns in your own pieces. These are just some weaving patterns that I frequently use, and I think should be in everyone's arsenal. They should know how to do these, even if you don't use them very frequently. They're still very nice to know and to base other designs off of. So that's it for this video. I hope you've enjoyed it. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.